Perhaps it is no coincidence that I am finishing this talk for the Workers' World Party Conference on November 15th. Today marks the third anniversary of Workers' World Party comrade and transgender revolutionary communist Leslie Feinberg's untimely death. In the last section of Leslie's 1992 publication, Transgender Liberation, a movement whose time has come, Leslie closes out with these words: "The institutionalized bigotry and depression we face today have not always existed. They arose with the division in society into exploiter and exploited. Divide and conquer tactics have allowed the slave owners, feudal landlords, and corporate ruling classes to keep for themselves the lion's share of wealth created by the laboring class. Like racism and all forms of prejudice, bigotry towards transgender people is a deadly carcinogen. We are pitted against each other in order to keep us from seeing each other as allies. Genuine bonds of solidarity can be forged between people who respect each other's differences and are willing to fight their enemy together. We are the class that does the work of the world and can revolutionize it. We can win true liberation. The struggle against intolerable conditions is on the rise around the world, and the militant role of transgender women, men, and youth in today's fight back movement is already helping to shape the future." In Northwest Florida, where I live, I lead an organization called STRIVE, or Social Trans Initiative. We are a grassroots organization of working class, multinational, multi-gender people who provide many services to the transgender people of Northwest Florida and some surrounding areas. And when I say some surrounding areas, what I mean is that we help the transgender community from Pensacola all the way out to Tallahassee, which, for those of you who don't For those of you who are unfamiliar with the mass that is Florida, the exact the distance between Pensacola and Tallahassee is 196 miles. So we help transgender people for 200 miles around. Among these services are providing emergency housing for homeless transgender people, which there are a lot, payment allocations for hormone replacement therapy, food, transportation, medical co-pays, and any basic needs that the community needs. We are the only organization in the area who handles these types of situations, and we do not receive any federal assistance because we do not subscribe to the idea that we must bend to the government in order to receive money. The government doesn't give a fuck about us anyway. This need for basic supplies for transgender people was born out of the material oppression of transgender people. The majority of transgender people are working class, poor, and all are oppressed. Queer and transgender oppression is born out of the capitalist exploitation and white supremacy. Though white transgender people can and still do derive relative benefits from white supremacy, it is still crucial to understand that anti-queer and anti-trans attitudes and behaviors are also born of white supremacy. Putting this into historical context, we understand that in pre-feudal times, queer and trans identity was not only accepted but often celebrated. Then, with the creation of private property, with the seizing and sectioning off of previously communal public land by ruling class families, the oppression of queer and trans people began. Homosexuality or any sexual leanings away from heterosexual sex done only for reproductive reasoning was seen as a threat to land inheritance and thus to the continuation of private property. Because of this, trans people began to be demonized and shamed, and homosexual people began to be heavily persecuted. This began the system of exploitation by the white European ruling class that continued throughout the centuries until the colonization of the so-called New World and the subsequent slaughter of the indigenous people who celebrated gender variance with identities such as Two-Spirit, what we now know as Two-Spirit. This is the connection between white supremacy and queer and transgender oppression. Capitalism is at its end and survives only through continued imperialist war and exploitation of the masses. Queer and transgender people are no exception, and in fact are thoroughly part of the oppressed masses. Every intersecting identity, be it nationality, race, ability or disability, citizen status, etc., includes queer and transgender people. Therefore, the wild accusations that Marxist-Leninists are putting identity politics over everything are just that, wild and false bullshit. While it is true that focusing too deeply on a single identity in terms of political struggle, thank you, no, you're good, can put us onto an incorrect path towards liberalism, we must also look at how each of the oppressed identities interact and intersect with each other and apply those insights to the struggles of the working class. And yes, queer and trans people fit into every sector of oppression, but these are not the only sectors that intersect and overlap. Black women and undocumented migrants are two other groups that face heavy oppression. To fail to acknowledge any of these oppressed groups in order to avoid identity politics is to willfully deny the historical and material conditions that led to the exploitation and oppression of these groups. In order to defeat capitalism and bury it once and for all oppressed and exploited groups must be represented in order for the atrocities of capitalism to be finally realized. The exploitation of queer and trans workers also needs to be discussed. Transgender people face high amounts of unemployment, and even in the workforce, once we're in the workforce, we face discrimination from other workers and management. I myself am presently a full-time worker and still struggle to pay my bills. I share a house with a roommate who is also transgender and has been released from job after job. Due to the decline of heavy industry and the replacement of many already low-wage jobs with high-tech equipment, it becomes harder and harder to secure a stable income or to join a union to fight for better working conditions. This is merely another function of capitalism's inevitable decay and affects trans workers disproportionately to the rest of the workforce. As unions have declined that were created to build solidarity among workers, the homophobic and transphobic divide and conquer tactics by the ruling class capitalists have tainted both union organizing in the workplace itself, causing deeper divisions between queer and transgender workers and cisgender and heterosexual workers. Solidarity between all workers and oppressed peoples must be built back between these groups in order for all of us to be liberated and in order for socialism to be built and maintained. Thank you.